we got a guest coming up who is really one of the coolest people in the whole world. Has great jobs that you can have where he works over at the Natural Museum of History. What must have been your museum when you were growing up?
Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah. Constantly went there as school trips or whatever, yeah.
And,
great.
of course, the planetarium, the coolest part of that, he was running that, as well as the TV show Nova, which on PBS every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock. Check it out, pbs.org. Since now, Neil Degrasse Tyson. And this is a guy who does one of the coolest things in the world when you could explain science to the layman. And he's able to pull that off. One of the things that they're doing is Should We Go to Mars, which is always interesting.
Hell yeah.
Let's bring him on to the Ron and Fez show, Neil Degrasse Tyson.
It's a god-awful small affair to the girl with the mousy hair, but her mommy is yelling no, and her daddy has told her to go, but her friend is nowhere to be seen. Now she walks through her sunken dream to the seat with the clearest view, and she's hooked to the silver screen. But the film is a sad thing for she's lived it 10 times or more. She could spit in the eyes of fools if they ask her to focus on sailors fighting in the dance hall. Oh man, look at those gay men go. It's the creepiest show. Take a look at the long man beating up the wrong guy. Oh man, wonder if he'll ever know who's in the best-selling show. Is there life on Mars?
In studio with us, and love the bit that you did on Mars. And you want us to go, right? You want us to
of course. I think how could you not? I mean, it's if you don't go, you're closing off fundamental of what it is to be human, and that's the urge to explore, and to explore, move a frontier forever as part of just what it is to be alive.
Yeah, and I kind of feel sad for kids growing up that weren't introduced to the space program the way I was, and the moon was the big thing. I think America had a different way of looking at space.
Indeed, we did. In fact, it spilled over into other states of mind that you could have. For example, you remember back then, you didn't have to go more than a week or two before a newspaper article or a magazine article would a feature story on the home of tomorrow, transportation of tomorrow, the city of tomorrow. Everyone had a very forward outlook, not only where we were, but where we would soon become.
Yeah.
And I don't see that happening at all anymore. The attitude is different.
That's really great because that Disney played into that too.
Yes,
And
thanks for remembering that.
Was,
in fact, they did. That's
was
right.
really involved in, here's how we're going to be doing our farming, and this is the thing about science that somehow I guess we take it for granted. Maybe it's the problem of science. Maybe it's the problem of government. You stop. And what I loved about your show, particularly the one that you did on Mars, is when you bring up a question like that, how many problems have to be solved before you could even attempt it? And how many of those problems are going to make life on Earth better?
Exactly. And in fact, there are people who say a common rebuttal to that is, well, why don't we just focus on the problems directly rather than have them spill out over and maybe have some other effort solve them? Here's the difference. If record of what it is to solve a problem directly, if you come straight at it, is one where, sure, you can solve those problems, but they tend to be a kind, like a Band-Aids. Right. All right, here's a problem, here's a Band-Aid. It'll help it heal, get a little better. if you fundamentally solve the problem from the beginning, that makes true innovation, and in most cases, it comes from fields that you never even thought they would come from. I'll give you an example. The idea that an atomic nucleus can align itself to a magnetic field. You can't get more physics obscure than that. There's a professor who was intrigued by this, out a way to detect new atoms in the universe with it. And it's called nuclear magnetic resonance. That's what it's called. And we're thinking, hey, one day we'll develop a magnetic resonance imager to images of the soft tissue in your body so you have to cut you open and know what's wrong with you. That's not what he's thinking.
Right.
He's thinking, I think atoms are cool. Study atoms. And man is transformed by discovery. And stop there. Well, even before X-rays. You know, when Wilhelm Röntgen went around with his high-energy signature, with his high-energy radiation, he wasn't at the moment saying, oh, one day we will photograph your bones and not have to cut you open to see what they're like. It became obvious application of it as soon as the phenomenon was discovered, but that's not what drove him to do it.
Yeah.
And can't expect a medical doctor to have come up with that discovery because they don't have that the physics training. So, yes, pollination of fields and disciplines is what makes revolutionary advance in our culture. And if you stop one branch of science from proceeding at its limits, you're cutting off the possibility of the greatest advances your society will ever see.
Not only the kind of advances like, to make for a greater society, but men will go, wait, I've been talking to these engineers, and I can now turn this into something that the original thinker wasn't even thinking about at all.
Innovations in science and technology are engines of economic growth, and we've known that since the Industrial Revolution. Einstein wrote down the first equation for the laser. The word didn't quite exist back then, but he gave the understanding of what's going on in an atom, later become the laser. When he did this, was he thinking, barcodes? No, he's not. Is he thinking, LASIK surgery? No. All this comes later when creative engineers and other folks inventors who see the hanging fruit of scientific discovery, and they exploit it and turn it into a marketable product.
That is exactly the way the whole thing is supposed to work. So what panics us about moving on? I talked about this many times on this show, that I think if you look back at the 1960s, two great things that America did was NASA and Motown. It's two spots that we were able to say during the Cold War, but, we'll battle back. But at the same time, I think that if you didn't have the English invasion in music, we wouldn't have had Motown. And those guys were able to say, wait, we've got to protect ourselves. So we need to get back involved in this thing where we want to make great things happen. Not okay things, but great things.
Keep in mind also that that decade, in spite of those two great achievements that we look back on, it was one of the ugliest decades of the history of the nation. It's probably only in its ugliness by a decade that had the Civil War, right? And odd that that's an exact full century apart from each other, the 1860s to the 1960s. So, because you're at war, just because bad things are happening, doesn't preclude the possibility of doing great things that you will choose to remember that decade for having accomplished.
That is what I think that we need to get back to as a country. We want to achieve great things. I mean, if you look at history, you would want to live in like the age of Pericles. You know what I mean? You want to be part of whatever time said, we're going to push the culture ahead.
Here's the tricky part. Just because you're living in a great time, you need to take it for granted, but it's not a forever thing. And look at America fading now, and we spend our effort reflecting on what we once were in the second half of the 20th century in particular. And other nations are rising now. As all the conversation is about China. It's not just a fear factor. It's really true. They're rising technologically, culturally. They have a space program. Here's an interesting point, an analogy to Motown. We prevented the Chinese from joining us, a partner and a collaborator in the space station, citing rights violations, which is our common way to get them out of kick them out of our sandbox. Well, to stop them, no. They said, we can't join your sandbox. We'll create our own